Hey Watch Fam, this is Colin from Meticulous and Meticulous.net here. Today we're coming live to you from the floor of my bedroom closet, and I'm in this weird location because I want to talk about Lume, and more specifically differences between Tritium and Luminova, and in this case Super Luminova, and more specifically kind of some nuance in 5-digit Rolex references and how they may react under UV, as well as, how they may glow. I've definitely done some research on this over the years, and, compared to, a lot of the dealers, I've only held, a small fraction, maybe a dozen or so of these watches compared to them that might have been hundreds or thousands. So I'm definitely not claiming to be an expert on this by any means, but kind of want to just give my take, and maybe it'll help someone else out. Maybe it'll spur a good conversation in the comments, or get, an expert to weigh in. But for example, today I brought kind of 5 watches from, relative similar era. So I have a early to mid-90s era IWC Mark XII, so Tritium dial, definitely an outlier in that it's not a Rolex, but same era, same, type of principle. I have an S serial, so the last of the Holes case 14270 Explorer 1s, so Tritium dial in hands, and then a U serial, non-Holes case, Tritium dial 14270 Explorer 1, a Swiss only, or the Luminova, or the transitional reference 16570 Polar Explorer, and then a 2007 engraved rehat 14060M, so Super Luminova no date Submariner. So kind of to give some further context, once I read about Tritinova dials, and Tritinova dials are in this kind of 98, 99 era. There's some people that speculate or have documented Rolex used some dials that still said, T-Swiss for, the Tritium mark dials, but they were actually Luminova. Or there's been like Tritium dials with Luminova hands because they were in the process of changing the manufacturing from Tritium to Luminova, and Rolex was kind of notorious for, using up the parts in their parts bin before, switching over. So when I read that, I immediately was concerned, like, oh, what if this is a Tritinova? And I definitely want it to be Tritium. And I say that because, like, if I wear this watch all day and I take it off and leave it on my dresser, and I get up to pee in the middle of the night, in a pitch black room when my eyes are adjusted, it's glowing faintly. And so I had concerns that maybe it was. However, as soon as I compared it to an actual Luminova dial under UV light, those concerns went away immediately, because the way Luminova behaves under UV light compared to Tritium, to me, are completely different. And so I have no concerns. I also don't have concerns just because the hands and the dials are all aging and developing patina in a consistent manner, and as well as, they're not staying stark white like everything is on this, or have like that slight greenish hue like you'll get sometimes on this. So the other nuance here is, another collector was talking to me, and this is kind of what spurred this video, is the hands will often appear to glow brighter or stronger and last longer than the dials. And I don't know if this was intentional, because, in theory, you can read or reference, time relatively well without any, reference to the dial furniture. If you're in the middle of the night, you can kind of see where your hand placement is and take a guess. So maybe that was intentional on the earlier Tritium ones. Maybe it was by design so they didn't get knocked out of the hands. I really don't know. I don't know if we have, as a community, any way of knowing. Maybe some of the other more experienced collectors or Rolex historians may know. The other wild card factor in my mind is I have to imagine from a manufacturing and mass manufacturing standpoint, there are naturally going to be discrepancies in dials and hands, and potentially even hands, compared to themselves, the hour to the minute to the second. In that I have to only guess or estimate that Rolex made a ton of hour hands, then a ton of minute hands, and then a ton of second hands, where they were going through different production lines. Or maybe they were made in entirely different years because they were making a bunch of hands and then they needed to make dials. And so, particularly with vintage, when you see, the company that made the dials might have been a completely different company or subsidiary than the company that made the hands or the rest of the watch. So, especially with, from like a parts bin or an assembly line manufacturing standpoint, I would not be at all surprised if the hands and the dials behave differently, as long as the way that they're behaving is consistent to the material. And again, I really don't see this being exhibited, but I don't necessarily know that I would be surprised if there were slight nuance differences in the hour to the minute to the second hand, just based on, the manufacturing. The other thing to call out is, so the Holes case, the S serial, definitely does not glow really much at all. Whereas the U serial will glow. Like I say, if I wear this all day, it'll faintly glow after your eyes are adjusted in a dark room all night. And that doesn't surprise me, despite there's only like 3 or 4 years in difference between these, because also in those for 3 or 4 years, we saw Rolex changed cases. We've seen they've changed ink or font color, font and type thickness and weight. We see differences in serifs. We see differences in actual dial manufacturing, where like some of the early 90s will exhibit the spidering or the matting or the cracking or the frozen dials. Neither of these have that, but my point being is I wouldn't be surprised if Rolex changed their Luminova or Tritium or Super Luminova mixture or compound or recipe over that era, because they were constantly tweaking stuff. They were changing the dials, they were changing the cases, they were changing the fonts, the types, the typefaces, the ink, type weight, all that stuff. So let me turn off the light and get the UV and kind of get into some nitty gritty here. So far you can see the only two that are even faintly glowing here are the Super Luminova 14060 and the Luminova 16570. The others, the camera's not even picking up. And when we hit them with UV, I think the two things to call out here are, one, let's see if I can get the camera to focus. You'll see even there's a slight difference in the hour hand and the minute hand, especially on this IWC, and that the hour and minute hand definitely glows more intensely than the dial plots. And so these are applied versus like the white gold surround that you see on like on the 5-digit Rolex. And so I think the other thing to call out here is when I see tritium, I see almost this like glittery or sparkly speckled kind of texture, specifically in the plots. So you can kind of see how it's almost, kind of frosted or snow-like in those plots there. They kind of speckle or sparkle, and you can't see it in this video. However, the hands do exhibit that same behavior under magnification. So you can see here that the hands on this Holes case, even though they match, to the naked eye in daylight in terms of how much patina they have, the hands are brighter and more uniform, And so again, I don't know if that's a different mixture intentionally or not, or if they applied the the tritium to the hands thicker, so it didn't fall out, or intentionally made a brighter mixture so that way you could tell time better at night. I don't know any of that, but I do believe this is tritium. This one is the same thing, but to an even more exaggerated degree. You can kind of see some of that speckling behavior I talked about in the minute and hour hand especially, and then also up on the dial there. So same thing in that you can also see this one glows fairly brightly, but it will fall off. And I say that, I haven't hit the Polar Explorer with UV light in 30, 45 minutes. And look at how bright it's glowing just from the light in the room from the beginning of this video. Whereas the Tritium 14270 is already fading. And you can see that the dial is fading faster than the hands. And you can kind of see that speckled appearance I'm referencing again in both the hour and the plots and the hands. And again, that's why I think the behavior is consistent from Tritium to Luminova. And then from Tritium to the Tritium, you can't even see the Rolex Explorer anymore. It's not glowing at all. So the 97, you can see how much it's faded already, is definitely exhibiting, it's glowing more, but it's consistent, like the way the lume reacts to the UV light, and it's fading very quickly. Whereas we see on these Luminova examples, it glows like very even. You don't see that speckling. You don't see any of that like crystallization that you saw in the Tritium, and it's blue. And it's like kind of like a light blue, kind of like a snow kind of. Whereas this is definitely, yellowish green and has that kind of speckling or crystallization. And then if we go to the Super Luminova, it's also blue, but even the color correction, I guess, on the UV light and on the camera is maybe not ideal for this, but in person to the naked eye, the blue is even darker. Like if you think of like that dark blue you see in like an iceberg, where it's like that frozen water look, it's a richer or darker blue on the Super Luminova. So all this is to say, I think there are definitely variances, across these watches and across how they're manufactured and when they're made and the type of mixture, and variances between the hands versus the dials. That's also to say that I do think the most important thing when determining if you have, Tritium versus Luminova, or if the hands are original on a Tritium dial, is, are they reacting consistently, even if they're of different brightnesses or different strengths, because we don't know if they used a different compound or were made even in a different year between the hands and the dials. But at least they're behaving the same way. They're developing patina in the same manner, and they're fading at a similar rate, albeit the hands are brighter. And they're both exhibiting that same kind of crystallized or speckled texture under UV, whereas the Luminova dials don't seem to do that at all. So that's kind of my 2 cents. Definitely weigh in the comments of maybe some of your experience or what you see, or how you identify dials from this era or hands, to make sure they're original and Tritium and correct. Thanks for watching.